Mom, where are my wheels? 8 words. That's all it took to shatter Laura Bennett's entire world at 6 in the morning. She stood frozen on the porch staring at a steel chain that had been sliced clean through the only sign left of the $10,000 wheelchair that was her son's freedom gone. No truck, no footprints worth following. Just empty concrete where Ethan's whole world used to sit waiting for him every single morning. Before we continue, if stories like this hit you right in the chest, hit that subscribe button and follow along to the very end. And drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The alarm on Laura Bennett's phone went off at 5:40 in the morning, but she was already awake. She'd been awake for almost 20 minutes lying on her back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like the shape of Ohio, listening to Ethan's breathing through the thin wall between their 2 rooms. Steady, even, good. That was the first thing she checked every single morning before her feet even touched the floor. Was he breathing okay? Was the pain bad last night? Did he sleep? She rolled out of bed, careful not to make the springs creak, and patted across the cold linoleum in her socks. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, if you wanted to be generous about calling the second one a bedroom, a kitchen the size of a closet and a bathroom where you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out. It wasn't much. But it was theirs, and Laura had fought like hell to keep it theirs. She cracked open Ethan's door an inch and peeked in. Her son was lying in his bed, eyes still closed, dark blonde hair sticking up in 3 different directions, looking for all the world like any other 8-year-old boy who'd rather sleep another hour than face the day. Except Ethan couldn't just hop out of bed like other 8-year-olds. Ethan's legs hadn't worked right since he was 4 years old, and every year the doctors had a slightly different name for it. A slightly more complicated explanation, but the bottom line never changed. His muscles were failing him, slowly, steadily, and there wasn't a cure, just management, just devices, just the daily grind of making a body that didn't cooperate get through another 24 hours. "Hey, Bug," Laura whispered, stepping inside. Ethan's eyes fluttered open. "Is it time? It's time." He groaned, the universal groan of every kid on earth who didn't want to get up for school. And for just a second, just one beautiful second, he was exactly like every other kid in America. Laura held on to that second every single day. It was the only thing that kept her going some mornings. 5 more minutes, Ethan mumbled. "You said that 4 minutes ago." "Then 5 more minutes from now." Laura smiled despite herself and sat down on the edge of his bed. She brushed the hair back from his forehead, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. The apartment building groaned around them, the way old buildings do, pipes ticking somewhere in the walls, a neighbor's television murmuring through the floor above. Outside, a truck rumbled down the cracked street, exhaust hissing. "Did you sleep okay?" she asked. "My legs hurt a little. Not bad, though. You want the cream before we go down? Can we just go? I want to see if Marcus is at the bus stop today." Laura's chest tightened the way it always did when Ethan talked about Morris. Wanting to be like the other kids, wanting to race to the bus stop, wanting things that should have been simple and weren't. "Yeah, baby, let's go see Marcus." This was the part of the morning that nobody saw. Nobody clapped for this part. There was no audience, no applause, just Laura sliding her arms underneath her son's body, one arm under his shoulders, one arm under his knees, and lifting him the way she'd lifted him every single morning for almost 2 years now, ever since the apartment's narrow hallway made it impossible to wheel him from his bedroom to the porch. He was getting heavier. She felt it more now than she had 6 months ago. Her lower back screamed at her, sometimes deep into the night, but she never told anyone that because what was the alternative? Let him crawl. Make him feel like more of a burden than the world already made him feel. "You're getting big," she grunted, only half joking as she carried him down the narrow hallway. "Sorry," Ethan said quietly. "Don't you dare apologize for growing, Ethan Bennett. I want you huge. I want you so big, I can't even pick you up anymore." "Then how will you get me to my chair?" "We'll figure it out. We always figure it out." That was the truth of Laura Bennett's life in 5 words. They always figured it out. They'd figured out the hospital bills when insurance fought every single claim. They had figured out the school district when the elementary school said they didn't have the budget for a ramp, and Laura had shown up to 3 school board meetings in a row until they found the budget. They'd figured out birthdays on a server's tips and Christmas on layaway, and somehow, some way, 8 months ago, they'd figured out the single most important thing Ethan had ever owned in his life. The wheelchair. It wasn't just a wheelchair. Laura hated when people called it that, like it was the same thing you'd find folded up in the corner of a hospital hallway. This chair had cost $10,000 money that didn't exist in Laura's world. Money she'd cobbled together from a settlement, a fundraiser her coworkers ran without telling her, and a loan from her sister that Laura still felt sick about every time she thought of it. The chair was custom built for Ethan's exact body, his exact condition, designed by a specialist who understood neuromuscular degeneration in a way that no off-the-shelf model ever could. It had a tilt and recline system that took pressure off his spine. It had a control panel he could operate with minimal hand strength because even his grip was getting weaker. It had wheels engineered to handle the cracked, broken sidewalks of their neighborhood without jarring his body apart. It wasn't equipment. It was Ethan's legs. It was his independence. It was the difference between a boy trapped inside four walls and a boy who could roll himself to the window, roll himself to the kitchen table, roll himself eventually down the block to see his friends without his mother having to carry him like a sack of flour every single time. Laura carried him down the last flight of stairs, out the heavy front door, onto the porch, where the chair sat every night chained to the iron porch railing with a thick steel cable lock that Laura had bought specifically because the internet told her steel cable chains were theft-resistant. She'd read forum after forum at 2 in the morning, after the chair first arrived, terrified of exactly the kind of thing that, well, she'd find out soon enough what kind of thing she should have been terrified of. She set Ethan down gently on the porch step, his back against the railing, and crouched down to unlock the chain. The lock came apart in her hand, but something was wrong. It didn't open like it usually did, the little click of the key turning the chain going slack. It just fell. Both ends fell away from each other, and Laura looked down and saw in the gray early light that the chain hadn't been unlocked at all. It had been cut. Clean through, a smooth, sharp edge on both ends like something out of a tool catalog, bolt cutters, or a grinder, something that didn't care about subtlety, something that just wanted through as fast as possible. Mom, Laura's hand was still wrapped around the broken chain. Her mind hadn't caught up yet. Her body was still operating on the assumption that this was a normal Tuesday morning, that any second now she would unlock the chair, lift Ethan into it, and walk him to the bus stop the way they did every single day. Her mind hadn't told her eyes yet that the porch was empty, that the chair was gone. Mom, where's my chair? Laura's head snapped up. She looked at the empty patch of concrete where the wheelchair had sat every single night for 8 months, the slight discoloration in the paint, where the wheels always rested, a permanent shadow of something that wasn't there anymore. Laura's voice came out strange, too high, not her own voice at all. It has to be here, it has to. She stood up so fast her vision went white at the edges. She spun in a circle on the small porch like the chair might materialize if she just looked hard enough. Like this was some kind of trick of the early morning light, like any second now, she'd see it tucked behind the porch post or knocked over by wind. It wasn't there. Mom, Ethan's voice cracked. He was 8 years old, and even at 8 years old, he understood what an empty porch meant. He understood it faster than Laura wanted him to, faster than any child should have to understand anything. Mom, where are my wheels? And that was the sentence. That was the exact sentence that broke something loose in Laura Bennett's chest, something that had been holding steady through years of hospital visits and insurance denials and exhausting 20-hour shifts. Something that finally, right there on that cracked concrete porch at 6:15 in the morning, gave way completely. Baby, I don't... Laura dropped to her knees in front of her son, taking his face in both hands. Her hands were shaking. She could feel them shaking against his cheeks. I don't know where it is. Someone took it. Someone cut the chain and they took it. Ethan's face did something Laura would never forget for the rest of her life. It wasn't crying, not at first. It was confusion, pure and total confusion, the look of a child trying to process a sentence that didn't make sense in his world. People didn't steal wheelchairs. Why would anyone steal a wheelchair? What would they even do with it? But I need it, he said very quietly, very simply, like he was explaining something to someone who hadn't understood the rules. I need it to go places. I know, baby. How am I going to get to school? I'll carry you. I'll figure it out. How am I going to see Marcus at recess? How am I going to... His breath was coming faster now, the panic finally catching up to the confusion, his small hands gripping the fabric of Laura's sleeves. Mom, I can't walk. I can't walk anywhere without it. What if it's gone forever? What if nobody finds it? Somebody's going to find it. Laura said the words before she even believed them, the way mothers do, the way mothers have done since the beginning of time, promising things to their children that they have absolutely no power to guarantee. I'm going to call the police right now, and they're going to find whoever did this, and we're going to get your chair back. I promise you. I promise. She didn't know yet how hollow that promise would turn out to be. She carried Ethan back inside. He was shaking now, whether from the early morning cold or from something deeper. Laura couldn't tell, didn't have the bandwidth to figure out, and sat him on the living room couch, wrapping him in the blanket from the back cushion. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling as she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, procedural, asking questions in the same flat tone they probably use for noise complaints in fender benders. Ma'am, is this an emergency in progress? No, but someone stole my son's wheelchair. It's a custom medical chair. It costs $10,000. He can't walk without it. Please, I need someone to come right away. Okay, ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down for me. Laura wanted to scream into the phone, calm down. Her 8-year-old son's only means of independent movement had been stolen off her porch in the middle of the night, and a stranger on the other end of a phone line was telling her to calm down. I'm calm, she lied. Please, just send someone. We'll have an officer out to you within the hour. An hour. Laura looked at Ethan wrapped in the blanket, his eyes wide and wet, and fixed on her like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly stopped making sense. An hour felt like a lifetime. But she said thank you, and she hung up, and she sat down next to her son and pulled him into her lap, even though he was getting too big for it, even though her back groaned in protest, because right now what Ethan needed wasn't a functioning wheelchair. He needed his mother's arms around him. It's gonna be okay, she murmured into his hair. I promise you, baby, it's gonna be okay. She had no idea, sitting there on that worn-out couch with her son trembling in her lap, that this morning was only the beginning of a nightmare that would strip away every last shred of faith she had left in the systems meant to protect people like them, and that the people who would eventually step in to save them wouldn't be wearing badges at all. But the officer who finally showed up almost 90 minutes later, not the promised hour, was a heavy-set man named Detective Frank Harris, somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of tired, sagging face that suggested he'd seen 10,000 mornings exactly like this one, and had stopped being surprised by any of them a long time ago. He climbed the porch steps slow like his knees hurt and looked at the cut chain on the ground without crouching down to examine it. This, where it was chained up, he asked, not really a question more, a confirmation for his notepad. Yes. Laura stood beside him, Ethan in her arms, because there was nowhere to set him down out here anymore, no chair to put him in. Her arms were already burning. It's a custom wheelchair. It costs $10,000. My son has a neuromuscular condition. He can't walk, and... Harris wrote something down unhurried. Anybody see anything cameras around here? No cameras. I asked the neighbors already. Nobody saw anything. It must have happened really late or really early. Right. Harris finally crouched, picked up one end of the chain, looked at the cut, dropped it again. Bolt cutters probably, or a grinder. Fast job either way. Can you test it for fingerprints? Or, ma'am. Harris stood back up with a small grunt of effort, and there was something in his voice now, something patient in the way adults are patient with children who don't understand how the world works. I'm going to be straight with you. We get calls like this all the time in this neighborhood. Bikes, generators, copper wire, catalytic converters. Anything with resale value walks off a porch around here eventually. 9 times out of 10, it ends up at a scrapyard within 24 hours, stripped for parts, and by the time we'd even think about running it down, it's already in pieces. Laura felt the blood drain out of her sight. Strip it for parts, it's a wheelchair. It's not. Nobody's going to strip a wheelchair for scrap metal. Who would even buy that? You'd be surprised what people will take apart for $50 at a scrapyard, ma'am. Aluminum frame, copper wiring, and the motor, if it's electric. It's electric. It has a tilt system. There you go. Could be worth something to the right buyer piece by piece. Harris flipped his little notepad closed. I'll file the report. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you we're going to have a squad car out here combing pawn shops for a wheelchair. We just don't have the manpower for that kind of follow-up on a property crime like this. This isn't a property crime. Laura's voice cracked, rising despite every effort to keep it steady, to keep it adult, to keep it composed in front of her son, who was listening to every word with his face buried half against her shoulder. This is my son's ability to leave the house. Do you understand what you're telling me? You're telling me nobody's going to look for it. I'm telling you the realistic odds, ma'am, and I'd rather do that than make promises I can't keep. Harris's tone wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was indifferent, the tone of a man who had filed 10,000 reports just like this one and watched 10,000 of them go nowhere and had made his peace with that fact a long time ago. I'll give you a case number. If it turns up at a pawn shop, sometimes they call it in. But I won't lie and tell you we're putting detectives on a stolen wheelchair case. We don't have that kind of bandwidth. He can't walk, Laura said again, quieter now because the fight was draining out of her, and something colder, something more desperate was rushing in to fill the space. Do you understand that he has no other way to get around? I have to carry him everywhere now. To school, to the bathroom in public places, everywhere. Harris looked at Ethan for the first time, really looked at him, and for just a second, something flickered behind his tired eyes. Something that might have been guilt, might have been sympathy, might have just been the recognition of a man clocking out in 11 months and not wanting to add one more impossible case to the pile before he did. But whatever it was, it didn't change anything. I'm sorry, kid, he said to Ethan, and it sounded almost genuine. Then to Laura, I really am sorry. I'll do what I can on my end. Case number is going to be on that paper I give you. You call that number if anything turns up. He handed her a slip of paper and walked back down the porch steps, his car idling at the curb, and that was it. That was the entire weight of the justice system's response to the single most devastating thing that had ever happened to Laura Bennett's family. A case number on a slip of paper. She watched the patrol car pull away from the curb, taillights fading down the cracked street, and something hardened in her chest, something that felt almost like the moment ice forms on a lake, quiet, total, and impossible to undo. If nobody else was going to look for Ethan's chair, then Laura would. She just didn't know yet how far that search would take her or who would eventually answer when the entire world had refused to listen. Well, the next 3 days were the longest of Laura Bennett's life. She called in sick to her diner job the first day. She couldn't carry Ethan to the bus stop, couldn't carry him into school, couldn't do any of the basic mechanics of a normal Tuesday without the chair, and she spent the morning instead on the phone with the chair's manufacturer, a specialty medical equipment company, 3 states away, begging for information about replacement costs. Ma'am, I understand this is an emergency, but a chair like Ethan's isn't something we keep in stock. It's built to his exact specifications. Spine curvature, hip width, grip, strength accommodations, rebuilding that from scratch would take 6 to 8 weeks minimum, and the cost would be the same as the original, $10,200. $10,000. Laura had $412 in her checking account. She hung up the phone and sat very still in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the walls of her life close in around her in a way they hadn't closed in even during the darkest stretches of Ethan's diagnosis. Because back then, at least there had been a path forward, even if it was a hard one. Now there was just a wall, a $10,000 wall with no door in it. She called the school and explained the situation, and the principal was kind about it. Genuinely kind, but kindness didn't solve the practical problem of how Ethan was supposed to get from the front doors of the school to his classroom, down the hallway, into the bathroom without a chair and without his mother present to carry him. We can look into a loaner chair from the district, the principal said. It won't be anything like his custom one. It might not fit him properly, but it's something while you sort this out. A loaner chair. A chair that didn't fit his body, didn't account for his spine, didn't have the support system that kept his muscles from seizing during long stretches sitting upright. It was something. It was also an insult layered on top of an injury, and Laura accepted it anyway because something was better than nothing, because Ethan needed to be in school, needed to see his friends, needed some semblance of his life to keep moving, even while the rest of it had ground to a halt. She went back to work the second day because she had no choice. The diner didn't pay sick leave and rent didn't care about stolen wheelchairs. And she dropped Ethan off with her neighbor Donna, an older woman 2 doors down, who'd always had a soft spot for Ethan and who agreed without hesitation to watch him during the hours Laura couldn't. But Laura's mind wasn't on the diner. It wasn't on the orders she dropped, the tips she fumbled to count, the apologies she made to a table of impatient businessmen for being slow. Her mind was 3 states away on a wheelchair manufacturer's price list, on a detective's indifferent face on the slip of paper, with a case number that felt more and more like a tombstone with every passing hour. That night, after Ethan was asleep fitfully, restlessly, the loaner chair clearly causing him discomfort. She could see even in his sleep, Laura sat at the kitchen table with a stack of printer paper and a black marker, and she made flyers. Stolen custom medical wheelchair. She wrote it in block capitals at the top, then a description below the brand, the color, the distinguishing features. A photo she printed from her phone showing Ethan sitting in it at his birthday party 3 months earlier, grinning, his arms thrown up over his head in some kind of celebratory pose. Reward if found, no questions asked. Her phone number at the bottom written 4 times across the page so it could be torn off like a tab. She made 200 copies at the 24-hour print shop 2 blocks from her apartment, paying with money that was supposed to go toward groceries, and the next morning before her shift, she walked. She walked the entire industrial stretch of her neighborhood, stapling flyers to telephone poles, taping them to bus stop, shelters, sliding them under windshield wipers in parking lots. She walked into every pawn shop within a 2-mile radius and asked the same question over and over, watching the same blank or irritated faces shake their heads no. She walked into the scrapyard on 5th Street where a man with grease-blackened hands told her not unkindly that wheelchairs came through sometimes but usually already stripped down, and he hadn't seen anything matching her description, but he'd keep an eye out. She walked for 6 hours straight that first day, and her feet bled into her socks by the time she got home, and Ethan asked her why she was limping, and Laura told him she'd just been on her feet too long at work because some lies you tell to protect the people you love, and this was one of them. By the end of the week, she'd papered half the neighborhood. She'd posted in every community Facebook group she could find, in every local lost and found page, in a subreddit for the city that she didn't even know existed until she went searching for it at 2 in the morning, desperate and half out of her mind with exhaustion. She stood outside the grocery store and handed flyers to strangers, looking them in the eye, saying the same sentence over and over until it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a prayer she was reciting on autopilot. He's a prisoner without it. Please, if you see anything, please call me. Most people took the flyer with a sympathetic nod and forgot about it before they reached their car. A few people actually stopped, actually looked at the photo of Ethan grinning in his chair, and Laura watched something shift in their faces. Recognition. Maybe that this wasn't an abstract crime statistic. This was a little boy's whole world folded up and gone. But sympathy didn't bring the chair back. Sympathy didn't put Ethan in a seat that fit his body properly. Sympathy didn't undo the slow, grinding hopelessness that Laura watched settle over her son like a fog with every day that passed without his chair. "Mom," Ethan said one night, almost a week after the theft, as Laura tucked him into bed, "do you think we're ever going to find it?" Laura sat on the edge of his bed, and for the first time since the morning the chain had been cut, she didn't have an automatic reassurance ready. The well of false confidence she'd been drawing from all week was running dry, and Ethan, sharp as he was, smart as he was, could read the hesitation on her face before she even said a word. "I don't know, baby," she admitted, and it cost her something deep to say it. "I'm trying everything I can think of. I really am. The loaner chair hurts my back. I know. And it doesn't go fast enough for me to keep up with Marcus at recess. He has to wait for me, and I can tell he doesn't like waiting." "Did he say that?" "No, but I can tell." Laura felt something crack open behind her ribs, a fault line of grief and rage and helplessness, all braided together so tight she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She kissed her son's forehead and told him to sleep, and she walked into the kitchen and stood at the sink with both hands braced against the counter, staring at nothing, breathing through a wave of emotion so total it nearly buckled her knees. She thought about the detective's tired, indifferent face. She thought about the case number on that slip of paper, a number she'd called twice already, both times reaching voicemail, both times leaving messages that were never returned. She thought about every system in her life that was supposed to protect her son, the school district that had fought her on a ramp, the insurance company that had fought her on coverage, the police department that couldn't be bothered to look for a stolen child's wheelchair. And she felt something inside her go cold and quiet and resolved. If the systems wouldn't help her, she would find another way. She didn't know what that way looked like yet. She didn't know that 3 days later, one of her flyers soaked from an overnight rain, curling at the edges, stapled crooked to a telephone pole near a railroad crossing on the edge of town, would catch the eye of a man named Marcus Webb as he walked out of a gas station with a pack of cigarettes in his hand. She didn't know that Marcus Webb wore a leather vest with a winged skull patch on the back. She didn't know that he would stop and read the flyer twice and pull out his phone to take a photograph of it before continuing onto his motorcycle parked at the curb. She didn't know that less than a mile away, inside a brick building, with reinforced steel doors and motorcycles lined up in rows along the gravel lot, a man named Cole was about to be handed a photograph of her flyer, and that everything in her life was about to change in a way that no detective, no insurance adjuster, no system she'd ever dealt with had been capable of delivering. All Laura knew, standing at that kitchen sink with her hands shaking against the cold counter, was that she had run out of doors to knock on. She just didn't know yet that the right door had already found her. Marcus Webb didn't say a word when he walked into the clubhouse that evening. He just set his phone down on the table in front of Cole's screen, still lit with the photograph of a rain-soaked flyer, and waited. Cole picked up the phone with 2 fingers the way a man picks up something he already suspects matters more than it looks like it should. He read it once fast, the way he read everything fast, and then he read it again slower, his jaw tightening with each line. Stolen custom medical wheelchair. A photo of a boy, grinning, arms thrown up, sitting in a piece of machinery that clearly cost more than most cars in this neighborhood. Reward if found. No questions asked. Kid can't walk, Marcus said, finally breaking the silence. Saw it outside the Sunoco on 5th. Soaked through. Somebody's been putting these up for days, looks like. Half the staples are rusted already. Cole didn't answer right away. He kept looking at the photo of the boy's face, that wide, unguarded smile. The kind of smile that didn't know yet what the world was capable of taking from a person. Cole had 2 daughters of his own, grown, now gone from the house, but he remembered exactly what that kind of smile looked like. And he remembered exactly what it felt like when the world started chipping away at it. $10,000 chair, Cole said quietly. Custom built. Somebody cut a chain to get it. That's what it says. And the cops, Marcus shrugged the particular shrug of a man who already knew the answer before he asked the question. Number on the flyer's a personal cell, not a precinct line. She's doing this herself, putting these up on telephone poles like she thinks the neighborhood's going to solve it for her because nobody else will. Cole set the phone down on the table harder than he meant to, and the sound of it cracked through the room like a small gavel. He'd built this chapter on something specific, something most people on the outside never understood, and most people on the inside rarely talked about out loud. It wasn't about chaos. It wasn't about lawlessness for the sake of it. It was about a code, an old, unwritten, brutally enforced code that said certain things didn't happen on this club's territory, not while they had breath in their bodies to stop it. You didn't put your hands on a woman, you didn't put your hands on a child, and you sure as hell didn't take the one thing standing between a disabled kid and a life trapped inside 4 walls. That wasn't a crime to Cole. That was a violation of something deeper than law. That was a violation of decency itself. Get me everybody, Cole said. Marcus blinked. Tonight. Within 40 minutes, the clubhouse had filled with the low rumble of engines pulling into the gravel lot one after another, headlights sweeping across the brick walls, men in leather vests filing in through the heavy steel door with the particular quiet of people who already sensed something serious was coming. Cole didn't call full meetings for nothing. Everybody in that room knew it. He stood at the head of the long wooden table, the flyer photo blown up now on the projector screen mounted on the wall. Marcus had emailed it to himself and printed it bigger because Cole wanted every man in the room to see that boy's face before he said another word. This is Ethan Bennett, Cole said, his voice carrying easily through the room without him needing to raise it. 8 years old, some kind of muscle condition, can't walk on his own. His mother scraped together 10 grand for a custom chair built specifically for his body. 8 days ago, somebody cut the chain off her porch and stole it. The room had gone dead silent. A few men shifted in their seats. Somebody near the back muttered something under his breath that nobody asked him to repeat. Cops told her it's probably already stripped for scrap. Told her they don't have the manpower to chase down a stolen wheelchair. Cole let that sentence sit in the air for a second, let it breathe. Let every man in that room feel the particular kind of disgust that sentence deserved. She's been walking the neighborhood for a week, papering telephone poles, begging strangers outside the grocery store. Nobody's helping her. We're helping her, said a man near the middle of the table, younger. Heavier built a guy everybody called Tank for reasons nobody outside the club fully understood. It wasn't a question. We're helping her, Cole confirmed. Tonight, I want this thing found before that boy wakes up tomorrow morning. That's a tight window, somebody said. I don't care if it's a tight window. A kid's been sleeping without his legs for 8 days because some piece of garbage decided medical equipment was an easy score. Cole's voice finally rose just slightly, just enough to make the windows feel like they were holding their breath. We moved tonight. Every scrapyard, every pawn shop, every fence who's ever done business within 50 miles of this clubhouse. Somebody knows something. Somebody always knows something. Chairs scraped back from the table. Men were already pulling phones out, already dividing up territory, already falling into the particular rhythm of an organization that had done exactly this kind of work more times than any of them would ever admit to a courtroom. Cole held up a hand, and the room settled again. One more thing. He looked around the table, meeting eyes one by one, the way he always did when he wanted something to land hard and stick. We do this clean. We get information. We don't leave bodies. We don't leave a mess that gets traced back to us. But I want it understood, whoever did this isn't getting a polite conversation. Whoever did this is going to understand exactly what they took and exactly who's coming to collect for it. A low murmur of agreement rolled through the room, the particular sound of men who had been waiting their whole lives for a reason that actually mattered, a fight that actually meant something beyond turf and money, and the petty grievances that usually filled their nights. This one was for a kid who couldn't walk. This one mattered. Laura had no idea any of this was happening. While 20 men pulled on leather vests and fired up engines across town, she was standing in her kitchen at 11 at night, staring at a stack of unpaid bills she'd been avoiding for 3 days, the numbers swimming together into a blur she couldn't make sense of anymore. Ethan was asleep or pretending to be. She suspected the way kids do when they don't want to worry their parents but can't actually quiet their own minds. She'd checked on him twice already, watched the rise and fall of his chest, watched the loaner chair sitting useless and ill-fitting in the corner of his room like a hollow promise. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a text from her sister Megan, 3 states away, the same sister who'd loaned her the money for the original chair. Any news? Laura's thumb hovered over the screen for a long time before she typed back. No, cops basically told me to give up. I'm not giving up. I'll find it myself if I have to. You can't do this alone, Laura. Watch me. She set the phone down harder than she meant to and pressed both palms flat against the cold counter, breathing through the particular exhaustion that lives somewhere past tired, somewhere in the territory of bone-deep depletion. She thought about calling out of work again tomorrow. She thought about the $400 in her account dwindling toward nothing. She thought about Ethan's face that morning, the hollow disappointment in his eyes when the loaner chair's wheel had caught on a sidewalk crack and nearly tipped him sideways in front of the whole bus line. She didn't hear the first engine pull up outside. She didn't hear the second or the third. It was the fourth, the low rolling thunder of multiple motorcycles idling in formation outside her building that finally pulled her attention to the window, and what she saw outside made her stomach drop straight through the floor. 5 men in leather vests standing in a loose half circle around their bikes at the curb looking up at her building. For one terrified second, every instinct in Laura's body screamed that something was about to go wrong, that this was the kind of thing you saw on the news right before something terrible happened. Men like this didn't show up outside your apartment at 11 at night for good reasons. Then one of them, older gray-bearded vest patched with a winged skull insignia, looked directly up at her window like he already knew exactly which one was hers and raised a hand. Not a threat, almost a greeting. Laura's heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't open the door. She stood frozen at the window phone clutched in her hand, thumb already hovering over the call button for 911, when her phone buzzed instead with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Bennett, we saw your flyer about your son's wheelchair. We're not here to cause trouble. We want to help find it. Can you come down for 2 minutes while... Laura read the text 3 times. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. This had to be a trick, a scam, something cruel preying on a desperate mother. She'd read about things like this, people who targeted vulnerable families who showed up offering help and left with whatever they could take. She wasn't an idiot. She knew what predators looked like dressed up as good Samaritans. But there was something about the photo on her flyer staring back at her, in her mind Ethan's face, his desperate question every single night. Do you think we're ever going to find it? That made her fingers move anyway, made her grab her keys, made her walk down those stairs, even as every rational fear in her body screamed at her to stay inside and lock the door. She stepped out onto the porch, the same porch where the chain had been cut 8 days ago, and stood facing 5 men who looked like they'd walked straight out of every nightmare a single mother in a rough neighborhood had ever had about strangers on motorcycles. I'm Laura, she said, voice steadier than she felt. Bennett, it's my son's chair. The gray-bearded man stepped forward, removing his sunglasses despite the dark, an oddly formal gesture that put her slightly more at ease than she expected. "Name's Cole," he said. "We run the chapter on the east side. One of my guys found your flyer tonight." His voice was low, even carrying none of the menace his appearance suggested it might. "I've got 2 daughters of my own, grown now, but I remember what it's like trying to keep a kid safe in a world that doesn't always cooperate." Laura's throat tightened. "The police already told me it's probably already scrapped. Gone for parts. Maybe." Cole's eyes didn't waver. "Or maybe whoever stole it doesn't know what he actually took, and we find out exactly where it is before he figures out it's not worth scrapping it at all." He paused. "We've got people already moving on this tonight. Scrapyards, pawn shops, the kind of places cops don't bother checking unless somebody forces their hand. I just need you to tell me everything you remember. Every detail. What it looked like, what was different about it. Anything that makes it stand out from a normal chair." Laura stared at this man, this stranger, leather-clad, tattoos crawling up both forearms, a patch on his chest that named an organization she'd only ever heard mentioned in hushed, fearful tones, and felt something break open inside her that had been clenched tight for 8 straight days. "Why would you do this?" she asked, and her voice cracked right down the middle. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." Cole looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that looked almost like old grief, old memory, something Laura couldn't name but instantly recognized as real. "Because somebody took something from a kid who already has it harder than most people will ever understand," Cole said simply, "and nobody who's supposed to help you bothered to. That doesn't sit right with me, doesn't sit right with anybody in this club." He gestured to the men behind him. "So we're going to go find it, tonight if we can." Laura's hands were shaking again, but for an entirely different reason now. She gave him every detail she could remember: the brand, the tilt mechanism, the small scuff on the left wheel from a curb 6 months back, the sticker Ethan had insisted on putting on the headrest, a small cartoon dinosaur that Laura had let him pick out himself at the hospital gift shop. Cole wrote none of it down. He just listened fully, completely, the way almost nobody had listened to Laura in the 8 exhausting days since the theft. "We'll find it," he said when she finished. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite a promise either. It was something colder and more certain than either. "Go back inside, get some sleep if you can. I'll be in touch." He turned and walked back to his bike without waiting for her to respond. And within 90 seconds, 5 engines roared to life in sequence and pulled away from the curb, taillights disappearing down the cracked street in the same direction Laura had walked 100 times that week, with nothing but flyers and exhaustion to show for it. She stood on the porch for a long time after they'd gone, staring at the empty street, not entirely sure what had just happened, not entirely sure whether to feel hope or terror or some impossible combination of both. She didn't go back to sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, waiting for a text that didn't come for hours. The Hells Angels worked through the night in a coordinated sweep that would have looked to any outside observer like chaos men splitting off in different directions, bikes thundering down side streets, leather-clad figures walking into half-lit pawn shops and scrapyards at hours when most legitimate businesses had long since closed for the night. But it wasn't chaos. It was precision dressed up as intimidation. Tank and another member named Reyes hit the scrapyards first because scrapyards were where stolen metal usually ended up fastest, and a wheelchair with an aluminum frame and copper wiring would be exactly the kind of thing a desperate thief might try to offload for quick cash without understanding what he actually had in his hands. The first 2 yards turned up nothing. Owners who genuinely didn't know anything who looked at the photo on Tank's phone and shook their heads with the particular nervous honesty of men who knew exactly who was asking and had no interest in lying to them. The third yard was different. A small operation on the edge of an industrial lot, chain-link fence, half collapsed in one corner, a single dim floodlight illuminating stacks of crushed cars and scattered metal. The owner, a thin, nervous man named Lou, answered the door of his trailer office in sweatpants, blinking against the headlights of 2 motorcycles parked directly in front of his door. "We're closed," Lou said automatically before he registered exactly who was standing in front of him. His face changed fast. "Not asking if you're open," Tank said, holding up his phone with the flyer photo. "Custom wheelchair, stolen off a porch about a week back. You see anything like this come through?" Lou's eyes flicked to the photo, then away too fast to tell as obvious as a neon sign. "No, never seen it." Reyes stepped forward, close enough that Lou had to physically back up half a step into his own trailer. "You sure about that?" Because your eyes did something funny just now. Lou, want to try that answer again? I'm telling you, I haven't. Kid can't walk, Tank said quietly, cutting him off. 8 years old. Whoever stole this thing left him stuck in his apartment for a week because his mother can't carry him everywhere. Cops don't care. We care. He let that sentence sit for a second. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think real hard about your answer because lying to us tonight is going to be a much worse decision than telling us the truth. Lou's composure cracked almost instantly. Men like Lou didn't have the stomach for this kind of pressure, didn't have anything resembling the loyalty that might have made him take a beating to protect a name. Okay, look, I didn't take it. I swear to God I didn't take it. A guy brought in some scrap metal pieces 2 days ago, said it was off an old hospital bed, paid me cash to take it off his hands. Wyatt, no paperwork. I didn't ask questions. That's not how this business works. You don't ask questions. What did he look like? Skinny guy, twitchy, looked like he hadn't slept in a week, looked strung out. You know the type. Lou was talking fast now, words tumbling over each other in his hurry to get this conversation over with. Didn't catch a name. Paid cash, like I said. Drove off in some beat-up pickup, dark color, maybe blue. Hard to tell in this light. You still have what he sold you. Yeah, some of it. Haven't processed it yet. Show us. Lou led them across the lot with a flashlight trembling slightly in his hand to a small pile of scrap metal pieces sitting near a crusher, waiting for its to turn. Tank crouched down and picked through the pile, and his jaw tightened the moment he saw it. A single armrest, distinctive with a small control panel embedded in the side, exactly matching the description Cole had relayed from Laura. The chair had been partially disassembled. Not destroyed, not yet, but stripped of pieces sold off in chunks to men like Lou, who didn't ask questions and didn't care what they were taking apart. This is from a medical chair, Tank said, holding the piece up. You knew that, didn't you? Lou's silence answered the question better than any words could have. Where's the rest of it? The frame, the wheels, the seat? He said he had more. Said he'd be back tomorrow with the rest, wanted to split it up, get more cash for it over multiple trips instead of dumping it all at once. Lou's voice had dropped to almost a whisper now. I swear I didn't know it was a kid's chair. I thought it was just hospital surplus. I see that kind of thing sometimes. You knew enough to not ask questions, Reyes said flatly. That's the same thing as knowing. Tank straightened up the armrest still in his hand, his mind already working through the pieces of information Lou had given them. A skinny, strung-out man, a dark pickup truck, a promise to come back tomorrow with the rest of the chair. The chair wasn't fully destroyed. There was still time. This pickup, I should take you get a plate number. No, I wait. Lou hesitated, something shifting behind his eyes. Actually, yeah. I always write down plates when people bring stuff in just in case, in case something comes back on me. It's in my book inside. 5 minutes later, Tank had a photograph of a handwritten ledger page, a partial plate number scrawled next to a date and a dollar amount, and a description of a man who matched exactly the kind of desperate, strung-out profile that explained and though never excused exactly the kind of person who'd steal a disabled child's wheelchair without a second thought about what they were taking. Cole's phone buzzed 20 minutes later as he sat in the clubhouse waiting room, and when he read Tank's text, something settled into place behind his eyes that looked a great deal like the calm certainty of a predator who had just caught the first real scent of its prey. "We've got a name," Cole said to the room, though they had no name yet, only a partial plate and a description, but Cole said it with such absolute certainty that nobody in the room doubted for 1 second that the rest of the details would follow fast. "Vince Holloway," came the voice from the doorway. A club member named Diaz's laptop opened, having run the partial plate through a contact at the DM Fifi that the club kept on a very particular kind of retainer. Registered owner of a blue Ford pickup, partial matches. Lives about 2 miles from here. Known to local PD for a string of petty theft possession charges. Real piece of work. Address, Diaz read it off, and Cole was already pulling his vest back on before the sentence finished. "Let's go say hello to Vince." Vince Holloway's house was the kind of place that told you everything you needed to know about a man before you ever knocked on his door. Overgrown grass, a porch light that had burned out months ago and never been replaced, blinds twisted shut in every window, like the house itself was trying to hide from the world. Cole didn't knock politely. He banged on the door hard enough to rattle the frame, and when nobody answered after the first 3 seconds, he banged again. A light flickered on somewhere inside. A shadow moved behind the blinds, and then very faintly the unmistakable sound of someone scrambling toward a back door. "Back's covered," Cole said into the small radio, clipped to his vest, not even raising his voice, already certain of the answer, before it came back through the speaker a half-second later. "Copy that. He's not getting past us." The back door banged open and slammed shut almost immediately, the sound of a man running directly into two more leather-clad figures, waiting exactly where Cole had positioned them before he'd ever knocked on the front door. There was a brief scuffle, a yelp of pain, and then silence. Cole pushed the front door open, unlocked now, abandoned in the panic, and walked through Vince Holloway's house like a man walking through his own property, completely unhurried, completely certain of exactly how this night was going to end. By the time he reached the small, cluttered living room, Vince was already sitting on his own couch, flanked by two club members, his face pale and sweating, his hands trembling with the particular tremor of a man whose body was already starting to scream for whatever substance kept it functioning. "You sold parts to Lou tonight," Cole said, no preamble, no introduction. "Off a kid's wheelchair you stole 8 days ago." Vince's mouth opened, some half-formed denial already forming, and Cole held up one hand, and something about that single gesture made the words die in Vince's throat before they ever fully formed. "Don't," Cole said quietly. "Don't waste my time tonight, Vince. I already know more than you think I do. I know you've still got the rest of that chair sitting somewhere because you told Lou you'd be back tomorrow with more pieces. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly where the rest of it is right now, tonight. And depending on how cooperative you are about it, this conversation is either going to end with you walking away from this couch in one piece, or it's going to end very differently." Vince's eyes darted between the men surrounding him, the particular calculation of a desperate man trying to find an exit that didn't exist. "It's in the truck," he said, finally, voice cracking. "Most of it's still in the truck. I was going to sell the rest tomorrow. I swear. I didn't know it was some kid's medical thing. I just saw it on a porch chain, looked easy to cut. I needed money, I wasn't thinking." "You weren't thinking," Cole repeated, voice flat and cold. "You weren't thinking about an 8-year-old boy who can't walk without that chair. You weren't thinking about his mother carrying him up and down stairs every single day because you decided his independence was worth a few $100 to feed whatever habit's got its claws in you right now." Vince said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Where's the truck?" "Garage, out back." Tank was already moving, already pulling open the side door that led to a small, detached garage behind the house. And 30 seconds later, his voice crackled back through the radio with a tone that finally allowed something like relief to settle into Cole's chest. "Found it. Frames here. Wheels are here. Seat assembly still intact. It's not destroyed. Looks like he hadn't gotten to taking the rest apart yet." Cole closed his eyes for one long second, exhaling slowly, feeling something in his chest unclench that had been wound tight since the moment he'd first seen that boy's photograph on the projector screen. The chair could still be saved. "Bring it around front," he said, then turned his attention back to Vince, who was watching him with the particular wide-eyed terror of a man who suddenly understood exactly how close he'd come to a very different kind of night. "You're going to remember tonight, Vince," Cole said quietly. "Every single morning you wake up from here on out, you're going to remember that you stole a disabled kid's legs out from under him so you could get high. And I want you to remember something else too. We know your name now. We know your face. We know where you live. If you ever so much as look sideways at this family again, or any family like them in this neighborhood, this conversation is going to look like mercy compared to what comes next." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He turned and walked out of the house, out into the night air, where Tank was already loading the disassembled frame and wheels of Ethan Bennett's wheelchair into the bed of one of the club's own trucks, with the careful, deliberate gentleness of a man handling something far more valuable than its weight in scrap metal would ever suggest. Cole pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd saved only hours earlier, and Laura Bennett picked up on the first ring, her voice raw with the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept, hadn't dared to hope, hadn't let herself believe that a phone call this fast could possibly carry good news. "Ms. Bennett," Cole said, and for the first time that entire long night, something warm crept into his voice. "We found your son's chair." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Laura Bennett began to cry, the particular kind of crying that comes not from sadness, but from a relief so total it physically hurts 8 days of fear and exhaustion and helplessness, breaking loose all at once in the middle of her kitchen at 3 in the morning. It's not in perfect shape, Cole continued gently. Some pieces were taken apart already, but nothing's destroyed. We're bringing it to a guy who can put it back together right, and then we're bringing it to you ourselves. Personally, I want you to know that. Thank you. Laura whispered the words, barely making it past the tears choking her throat. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know how to get some sleep, Cole said. We're not done yet, but the hard part's over. He hung up the phone and looked back at the house behind him, where Vince Holloway sat exactly where he'd left him, waking on his own couch, finally beginning to understand the true weight of what he'd taken from a family that had never done a single thing to deserve any of this. Cole climbed onto his bike, and as the engine roared to life beneath him, he allowed himself one brief moment of something that felt almost like satisfaction. They'd found the chair faster than even he had expected. But the night wasn't finished yet, because somewhere out there, a junkie thief who'd already proven he had no conscience left to speak of was still walking free. And Cole had every intention of making sure Vince Holloway understood in the clearest possible terms exactly what kind of mistake he'd made the night he decided an 8-year-old boy's freedom was worth less than his next fix. Vince Holloway didn't sleep that night, even after the leather-clad figures left his house and the roar of engines faded down the street. He sat exactly where Cole had left him, shaking, sweating through his shirt, staring at the front door like it might burst open again any second. He should have run. Some animal part of his brain kept screaming at him to grab what little cash he had left and disappear. Get out of the city. Get somewhere these men couldn't reach. But Vince Holloway had built an entire life out of bad decisions, stacked on top of worse ones. And the decision he made that night was no different. He called his cousin Dale. They took the chair back, Vince said, voice cracking, pacing his cluttered living room with his phone pressed so hard against his ear it hurt. Some biker gang, man. They came to my house. They knew everything they knew about Lou. They knew the plate on my truck. Slow down, Dale said. What chair? The wheelchair, man. The one I grabbed off that porch last week. I told you about it. You said it was some old hospital thing. It wasn't an old hospital thing. It was some kid's medical chair, custom built, and now there's a biker club out looking for whoever took it, and they already found me. Vince's voice climbed higher with every word panic bleeding through every syllable. I need somewhere to stay, tonight, right now. Dale was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone careful in a way that made Vince's stomach drop even further. You said biker club. Which one? I don't know. Man, they had patches, skull wings, something like that. Hell's Angels, Dale's voice had dropped almost to a whisper now. Vince, are you out of your mind? You stole from somebody, and the Hell's Angels are personally coming to your house. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was just supposed to be quick cash. I can't have that heat near my place, Dale said flatly. I got my own stuff going on. I can't have them tracing anything back to me. You're on your own with this one. The line went dead. Vince stood there in his living room phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing, and felt something close to true despair settle into his chest for the first time since this whole nightmare started. He had nowhere to go, no money, no friends willing to risk what he'd already brought down on himself. He grabbed a duffel bag, threw in whatever cash and clothes he could find, and walked out his back door into the night with no plan beyond simply being somewhere else when the sun came up. He didn't know yet that Cole had already put a man watching his house from a parked car half a block away. He didn't know that the moment he stepped off his own property, his location had been radioed in calm and unhurried. The way a hunter reports movement in a blind he's been sitting in patiently for hours. He just walked hood up, head down deeper into the industrial edge of town, toward an abandoned bowling alley he remembered from childhood, boarded up for almost a decade now. Half-collapsed roof, exactly the kind of place nobody would think to look. He had no idea he was walking directly into the only place in the entire city where the Hells Angels could box him in completely. Laura Bennett hadn't slept either, but for an entirely different reason. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she hadn't touched in over an hour, staring at her phone, replaying Cole's words on a loop in her mind. We found your son's chair. She'd cried until there was nothing left to cry, and then she'd cried some more, the particular hysterical relief of a woman who had spent 8 days bracing for the worst news of her life and had instead received the one phone call she'd stopped letting herself hope for. But relief had curdled slowly into something more complicated as the hours ticked past 3, then 4, then 5 in the morning. Because the chair wasn't here yet. Because some pieces had been taken apart already. Because she still didn't fully understand who these men were or what exactly they'd done to get that chair back, and some quiet, rational part of her brain kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question. What had it cost them? What had they done to that thief to get the truth out of him? She didn't let herself follow that thought too far. She couldn't afford to. Whatever had happened in the dark corners of this city that night, it had ended with her son's chair coming home. And after 8 days of begging a system that didn't care to even glance in her direction, Laura found she didn't have the moral energy left to interrogate the methods of the people who'd finally helped her. At 6 in the morning, she heard Ethan stirring in his room, and she went in to find him already awake, staring at the ceiling, his small face drawn with the particular exhaustion of a child who'd been quietly suffering for over a week without complaint. "Morning, Bug," she said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Did you sleep?" "Not really." She brushed his hair back from his forehead. "I have to tell you something, and I need you to not get too excited yet, okay? Because it's not finished. But I think we might be getting your chair back soon." Ethan's eyes went wide, his whole small body going rigid with a hope he was clearly afraid to fully feel. "Really, did the police find it?" Laura hesitated. How did she explain this to an 8-year-old? How did she explain that the people who'd actually helped them weren't wearing badges, weren't part of any system she could point to and say, "This is who protects us," but were instead a group of men most of the world had been taught to fear? "Not the police," she said carefully. "Some other people. They came to talk to me last night, and they found out who took it, and they're working on getting it back to us. I don't know exactly when, but I think it's going to happen." "What other people?" "Just people who wanted to help baby. People who heard about what happened and decided it wasn't right." Ethan considered this with the particular seriousness only children seem capable of, turning the information over like a puzzle piece that didn't quite match the shape of the world he understood. "Like superheroes." Laura laughed despite herself, a watery, exhausted laugh that came out half-sob. "Something like that, yeah. By 7 that morning, Cole had a name, a face, and a confirmed location. The man parked half the block from Vince Holloway's house had radioed in the moment Vince left through the back door, and 2 more bikes had picked up the tail from there, hanging back far enough to stay unseen, close enough to never lose him. They watched him walk through 3 different neighborhoods, doubling back twice in a clumsy, paranoid attempt to shake anyone following him, before finally disappearing through a gap in the fence surrounding the old Lakeview Lanes bowling alley. "He's holed up in the bowling alley off Route 9. The call came through to Cole, who was standing in the clubhouse garage watching 2 members carefully reassemble Ethan's wheelchair piece by piece on a workbench, treating the disassembled frame with a delicacy that looked almost tender, coming from hands covered in old motorcycle grease and fresh scars. "That place has been condemned for years," Cole said. "How many ways in and out? Front entrance boarded up but loose. Side loading dock around back. There's a busted window on the east wall big enough for a man to squeeze through. Cover all 3. Nobody goes in until I get there." Cole looked back at the workbench where Diaz was carefully threading the last bolt back into the chair's tilt mechanism, testing the recline function with the patient focus of a surgeon closing an incision. "How's it looking?" Cole asked. "Almost there," Diaz said without looking up. "Whoever built this thing built it right. Even half-stripped, the core mechanics are solid. Another 20 minutes, maybe 30, and it'll work exactly like it's supposed to." "And Vince?" Diaz finally looked up, something flat and unimpressed crossing his face. "He's not getting anywhere. We've had eyes on him since he walked out of his back door like a scared rabbit. Wherever he thinks he's hiding, he's not hiding from us." Cole nodded, satisfied, and pulled his vest back on for what felt like the 100th time in the last 12 hours. "Get the chair finished. I want it ready to deliver the second we wrap this up." He paused at the garage door, looking back at the half-assembled wheelchair one more time, that same flicker of old grief and fierce protectiveness crossing his weathered face. "And somebody call the rest of the chapter. I want this place surrounded before Vince even knows what's happening." Vince Holloway crouched in the dim, dust-choked interior of the old bowling alley, surrounded by the rotted skeletons of lane machinery and collapsed ceiling tiles, listening to his own ragged breathing echo off walls that hadn't heard a human voice in years. He'd convinced himself somewhere around hour 2 of hiding in this place that he'd successfully disappeared, that the bikers had given up, gone back to whatever business bikers had, and that by tomorrow he could slip out of the city entirely and start fresh somewhere far enough away that none of this would ever catch up to him. He should have known better. Men like Vince always convince themselves of exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment. The first sound that broke his fragile illusion of safety was an engine, just one distant idling somewhere outside the building. He told himself it was nothing, just traffic on the nearby road, just a coincidence. Then a second engine joined it, then a third. By the time the fourth and fifth engines rumbled to life somewhere close enough that he could feel the vibration through the cracked concrete floor beneath him, Vince's entire body had gone rigid with a fear so total it felt almost like paralysis. He scrambled toward the busted window on the east wall, the one escape route he'd identified when he first crawled into this place, and froze the instant he reached it. Two motorcycles sat directly outside engines, idling, two men in leather vests standing beside them with their arms crossed, watching the building, with the patient, unhurried confidence of men who already knew exactly how this was going to end. Vince backed away from the window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and turned toward the loading dock at the rear of the building instead. Blocked. 3 more bikes, 3 more men, the same patient stillness. He ran, actually ran, stumbling over debris and collapsed shelving toward the boarded-up front entrance, his last remaining hope, his heart hammering so hard he could hear nothing else. The boards had already been pulled loose. Standing in the gap where the front doors used to be, backlit by the gray early morning light, was Cole. Vince stopped dead in his tracks, chest heaving. Every escape route sealed the silence around him, so total it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. "Going somewhere, Vince?" Cole asked quietly. Vince's legs gave out from under him, and he sank to the dusty floor. All the fight, all the panic, all the desperate adrenaline draining out of him at once, replaced by something close to total surrender. "Please," Vince whispered. "Please, I told you everything already. I gave you the chair. What else do you want from me?" "I want you to understand something," Cole said, stepping through the bus in the boarded entrance, his boots crunching against broken glass and rotted wood. Behind him, more shapes filled in the doorway, silent patient, an audience for a sentencing that was about to be handed down without a single piece of paperwork. "I want you to understand exactly what you took from that family and exactly why a stolen wheelchair matters more than you ever bothered to consider. I know it was wrong. I was desperate. I needed money. Everybody's desperate, Vince." Cole's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which made it somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. "Desperate doesn't give you the right to take an 8-year-old boy's legs out from under him. You understand that boy hasn't been able to leave his apartment for over a week because of what you did. You understand his mother's been carrying him up and down 3 flights of stairs every single day because there was no other way." Vince said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like a pathetic excuse even to his own ears. "The cops told her it was already scrapped," Cole continued. "Told her to give up. You know what she did instead? She walked this entire neighborhood for a week straight, papering telephone poles, begging strangers because she refused to let her son believe nobody was looking for him. That's the kind of mother you stole from Vince. And the only reason that boy's getting his legs back today is because somebody finally cared enough to actually look." Cole crouched down in front of Vince, bringing himself level with the trembling man on the floor, his voice dropping lower, harder. "You didn't steal metal," Cole said. "You stole a child's freedom. And I want that to sit with you every single day for the rest of your life, because we are not the kind of people who forget faces, and we are not the kind of people who give second chances to men who hurt children. I won't. I swear I'll never come near that family again. I swear to God. I know you won't." Cole's voice carried absolute certainty. "Because if you do, this conversation we're having right now is going to look like the kindest thing that ever happened to you." He stood up, looking past Vince to one of the members near the door. "His truck. Where is it?" "Still parked back at his house. We already pulled what was left in the bed, couple more loose parts from the chair. Nothing major." "Strip it," Cole said simply. "Engine, electronics, anything with resale value. Sell it off and every dollar goes straight to that woman and her boy. Call it restitution." Vince's head snapped up, a fresh wave of panic crossing his face. "That's my truck, man. That's all I have. You should have thought about that before you cut a chain on a disabled kid's wheelchair," Cole said, already turning away, already finished with a conversation that had taken exactly as long as it needed to. "Consider yourself lucky this is the only thing you're losing today." He walked back out through the gap in the boarded entrance without another word, and the men who'd surrounded the building began peeling away one by one, engines firing up in sequence, the same coordinated, unhurried rhythm that had brought them here in the first place. Within 5 minutes, the old bowling alley sat silent again, Vince Holloway alone on the dusty floor, shaking, stripped of his truck, his pride, and whatever fragile sense of power he'd ever convinced himself he had. He didn't move for a long time after they'd gone. Back at the clubhouse, the wheelchair sat finished on the workbench, gleaming under the garage's overhead lights, every piece reassembled, every mechanism tested and retested until Diaz was satisfied it functioned exactly as it had the day it first arrived at Laura Bennett's apartment 8 months earlier. Cole walked the length of the garage, slowly running one calloused hand along the headrest, pausing when his fingers brushed against a small cartoon dinosaur sticker pressed into the corner. The detail Laura had mentioned, the one small piece of a little boy's personality stamped onto a piece of medical equipment that had become so much more than equipment. "It's ready," Diaz said, watching Cole's face carefully. "Tested the tilt system, the wheel alignment, the control panel. Everything's working clean." Cole nodded slowly, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Get the truck loaded, careful with it. You want to call her first, tell her we're coming?" Cole thought about it for a moment, then shook his head, a faint, almost boyish smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, an expression that looked strange and out of place on a face built mostly for sternness and command. "No," he said. "I think this one we deliver in person. I want to see that kid's face." Joe. Laura had managed maybe 40 minutes of fitful sleep on the couch when her phone rang again, jolting her upright with her heart already racing before she'd even fully processed where she was. "Ms. Bennett," Cole's voice calm and steady as it had been the night before. "We're about 20 minutes out. Figured you and Ethan should be there when we bring it home." Laura's hand flew to her mouth, the sudden flood of emotion almost knocking the breath out of her entirely. 20 minutes? Oh my God. Okay, yes, we'll be ready. We'll be right here. "We'll see you soon." She hung up the phone and ran into Ethan's room so fast she nearly tripped over the loaner chair parked uselessly by his bed. Ethan, wake up, baby, wake up right now." Her son's eyes shot open, immediately alert, immediately afraid, the particular hypervigilance of a child who'd learned over the last 8 days that sudden urgency rarely meant good news. "What's wrong, Mom? What happened?" "Nothing's wrong." Laura was laughing and crying at the same time now, sitting on the edge of his bed, taking his small face in both hands. "Baby, they're bringing your chair. Right now, 20 minutes. They found it and they fixed it and they're bringing it home to you." For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at her, processing his small face, cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally, slowly, like the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm, pure, unguarded joy. "Really, my chair? My actual chair with the dinosaur sticker?" "Your actual chair, dinosaur sticker, and everything." Ethan's arms shot around her neck so fast and so hard it knocked the breath out of her, and Laura held her son tight, feeling his whole small body shaking with a happiness that had felt impossibly out of reach just 12 hours earlier. "I have to get dressed," Ethan said, suddenly pulling back, scrambling against his own limited mobility to sit up straighter. "I want to look nice. Can you help me get dressed?" "Of course, baby, of course." As Laura helped her son into a clean shirt, her hands still trembling with the aftershock of relief, she found herself thinking about Cole's face the night before, steady, weathered, carrying some old grief she couldn't name, and the strange, impossible truth settling over her entire understanding of the world. The system that was supposed to protect them had failed completely. A detective with a badge and a gun had looked at her son's stolen freedom and called it an unsolvable property crime. And it had taken a group of men the world had taught her to fear, men with no badges, no paperwork, no obligation to her or her son whatsoever to do what the entire machinery of law enforcement had refused even to attempt. She didn't know yet that 20 motorcycles, not 5, were already en route to her building. She didn't know that word of what happened to Vince Holloway's truck had already spread through certain corners of the neighborhood, certain whispers reaching certain ears, including eventually the desk of one tired, indifferent Detective Frank Harris, who would soon find himself driving toward Laura Bennett's address for reasons that had nothing to do with any case number he'd ever filed. All Laura knew, sitting on her son's bed, finishing the last button of his shirt, while his hands trembled with excitement too big for his small body to contain, was that for the first time in 8 unbearable days, hope didn't feel like something she was forcing herself to fake. It felt real, and it was coming up the street 20 engines strong closer with every passing second. The first sound Laura heard wasn't engines. It was Ethan's voice, sharp with excitement, calling out from where she'd propped him up against the living room window. Mom, Mom, I hear them. I hear them coming. Laura's heart slammed against her ribs as she rushed to the window beside him. And within seconds, the low rolling thunder Cole had warned her about became impossible to ignore. Not 5 engines this time, but a sound that built and built until it felt like the whole street itself was vibrating. Windows rattling faintly in their frames, neighbors already stepping out onto their own porches to see what kind of storm was rolling through their quiet, struggling block on a Tuesday morning. That's a lot of motorcycles, Ethan whispered, eyes wide, nose pressed nearly flat against the glass. Yeah, baby. Laura's voice came out barely above a whisper, too. That's a lot of motorcycles. 20 bikes came around the corner in a formation so tight and so deliberate it looked almost choreographed, chrome catching the early morning light engines dropping into a lower rumbling idle as they pulled to a stop along the cracked curb in front of Laura's building. Doors up and down the street were opening now, people stepping out in robes and work uniforms drawn by a sound that didn't belong to their world, didn't belong to scrapyard sirens or distant gunfire, or the usual soundtrack of a neighborhood that had long since stopped expecting good things to happen on its streets. Laura scooped Ethan up gently, carefully, the way she'd done every single day for 8 straight days, and carried him toward the front door, her arms screaming with the same ache they always carried, but her heart pounding with something entirely different this time. She stepped out onto the porch, the same porch where a cut chain had once lain in pieces on the ground, and the sight in front of her stole every word out of her mouth before she could speak a single one. 20 men in leather vests stood beside their bikes in a loose, respectful line, and at the center of them, Cole was lifting something carefully out of the bed of a pickup truck, and there it was. Whole, intact, gleaming even like it had just rolled off some factory floor instead of being chain stolen, stripped and stitched back together over the course of one impossible night. Ethan made a sound in Laura's arms that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not quite a word, not quite a sob, something raw and overwhelmed that came from somewhere far too deep for an 8-year-old boy to have learned to access yet. That's it, Ethan said, voice cracking. Mom, that's my chair. That's really my chair. I know, baby. Is the dinosaur sticker still on it? Cole, close enough now to hear the question, looked up and smiled, the first full smile Laura had seen on his weathered face since the moment they'd met. Dinosaur sticker's right where you left it, son. Wouldn't have brought it back any other way. He carried the chair up the porch steps himself, setting it down gently in the exact spot where the chain had once held it overnight, and stepped back, giving Laura room to lower Ethan into the seat that had been built specifically, precisely, lovingly for his exact body. The moment Ethan settled into the chair, something in his whole posture changed. His shoulders dropped from around his ears for the first time in over a week. His hands found the controls, instinctively, fingers curling around the small joystick mechanism. And when he gave it the lightest possible push, the chair rolled forward 3 feet across the porch exactly the way it was supposed to, exactly the way it had 1,000 times before the world tried to take it away from him. Ethan looked up at his mother, and then at Cole, and then at the 20 strangers standing along the curb, watching a small boy reclaim his independence in real time. And the smile that broke across his face was so wide, so total, so unguarded, that several grown men standing in that line of leather vests had to look away for a second, clearing their throats, blinking hard against something they weren't prepared to feel on a random Tuesday morning. Thank you, Ethan said, looking directly at Cole. Thank you so much. I missed it so much. Cole crouched down to Ethan's eye level, something gentle and almost fatherly settling over his rough features. You don't got to thank me, kid. Nobody should ever be able to take this away from you in the first place. We just made sure that mistake got fixed. Did you find the guy who took it? We found him. Is he going to do it again? Cole's eyes flicked briefly to Laura, some unspoken communication passing between the two adults over the boy's head. No, Cole said simply. He's not going to do that again. Not to you, not to anybody else. Laura felt her throat tighten at the certainty in those 4 words, and the absolute bone-deep certainty of a man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep, unlike a detective with a badge who'd handed her a case number and a hollow apology and driven away without a backward glance. It was Marcus Webb, the same member who'd first spotted the soaked flyer outside the gas station, who's stepping forward next carrying a thick manila envelope that he handed directly to Laura without ceremony. What's this? Laura asked, though something in the weight of it already told her. Open it, Cole said. Laura's fingers fumbled with the clasp, and when she pulled back the flap and saw what was inside her knees nearly buckled right there on the porch. Stacks of cash, neatly bound, more money than she'd seen in one place in years. "We took up a collection last night," Cole explained. "Word got around the chapter fast about what happened to you and your boy. Everybody chipped in something. It's not gonna solve everything, but it should cover what you lost this week, get you caught up on whatever bills piled up. Maybe put something away for a rainy day." "I can't." Laura's voice broke completely now, tears spilling freely down her face. "I can't take this. This is too much. You've already done so much." "You're gonna take it," Cole said, not unkindly, but with the same flat certainty he'd used on Vince Holloway hours earlier, though this time wrapped in something infinitely gentler. Because a mother shouldn't have to choose between her rent and her son's medical equipment, and shouldn't have had to walk this whole neighborhood begging strangers for help that should have come from people whose job it was to help in the first place. Laura looked down at the envelope, then up at Ethan sitting tall and proud in his recovered chair, then back at Cole, and something inside her finally completely gave way. Not from grief this time, but from a gratitude so overwhelming it physically hurt to hold. "I don't know how to repay you," she whispered. "You don't owe us anything," Cole said. "Just take care of that boy. That's all the repayment any of us need." It was at that exact moment Laura crying, Ethan beaming in his chair. 20 bikers standing along a cracked curb in a neighborhood that had never seen anything like this. That a familiar sedan rounded the corner and slowed to a stop a short distance away. Detective Frank Harris stepped out of his car with the particular tense alertness of a man walking into a situation he didn't fully understand yet, one hand resting near his hip out of pure instinct, eyes scanning the scene in front of him with rapidly mounting confusion. Word had reached him an hour earlier through a contact at a local scrapyard. Something about a chop shop getting hit hard overnight, a known small-time thief showing up at the ER with what looked suspiciously like the early signs of a serious scare. And somewhere in that scattered, half-formed report, the name Bennett had surfaced, tied somehow to a wheelchair theft case that Harris himself had quietly written off and filed away. He'd come expecting chaos. He'd come expecting, if he was being honest with himself, to find some kind of crime scene, a body, and arrest evidence of the violence that everybody in this city assumed naturally followed wherever men in leather vests went. What he found instead stopped him dead in his tracks. He saw the wheelchair. He saw the boy sitting in it, glowing with a happiness Harris hadn't seen on a single face in this neighborhood in longer than he cared to admit. He saw Laura Bennett, the same exhausted, desperate woman he'd brushed off on her porch 8 days earlier, with a case number and an apology that cost him nothing, standing there crying tears that were unmistakably completely tears of joy. And he saw 20 Hells Angels standing in a respectful, almost protective formation around a single mother and her disabled son, looking for all the world like the most unlikely guardian angels this city had ever produced. "What's going on here?" Harris asked, walking up slowly, his voice carrying the particular careful neutrality of a cop who genuinely didn't know yet whether he was about to need backup or apologize for intruding on something he had no business interrupting. Cole turned to face him, unhurried, completely unbothered by the badge or the uniform or the authority it was supposed to represent. "Detective," Cole said evenly. "Funny seeing you here. This the case you told Ms. Bennett was already scrapped for parts not worth chasing down." Harris's face flushed recognition and embarrassment, crossing his features in rapid succession. "I never said—" "You said you didn't have the manpower." Laura cut in, her voice steadier now than it had been in 8 days, steadier than it had been since the morning she found that chain cut clean through. "You said it was probably already destroyed. You said there was nothing you could do." "Ma'am, I was being realistic about—" "They found it in 2 days," Laura said, and there was no anger in her voice now, just a quiet, devastating clarity. 2 days, detective. They found the thief, they found the chair, they fixed it, and they brought it back to my son personally. You gave me a case number and a phone call I never got a call back from." Harris stood there, badge gleaming faintly in the morning light, surrounded by evidence of exactly how badly the system he represented had failed this family, and for several long seconds, he had absolutely nothing to say. "I want to know what happened to the thief," Harris finally said, falling back on procedure, because procedure was the only thing he had left to hold on to. "If there was an assault, if there's a body somewhere—" "No bodies," Cole said simply. "He's alive. He's scared. He understands now exactly what he took and exactly why it mattered. And he's not going to touch this family or anybody else's medical equipment ever again, because he understands now what happens when somebody actually pays attention. That's vigilante justice, Harris said, though the words came out weaker than he probably intended, less an accusation now and more an observation he didn't quite know what to do with. Call it whatever you want, Cole said, but ask yourself something, detective. In 8 days, who actually helped this family? Was it the badge or was it us? Harris looked at Laura, then at Ethan in his chair. The boy's hands still resting on the controls like he was afraid the moment was a dream he might wake up from if he let go. He looked at the envelope of cash still clutched in Laura's hands. He looked at 20 men who, by every official definition the city had ever taught him, represented exactly the kind of lawless menace his entire career had been built around dismantling, and who had, in less time than it took most departments to process a single incident report, delivered more justice and more genuine help than Harris had managed to offer in 8 long days. I should still ask some questions, Harris said, but the conviction had drained almost completely out of his voice. About what happened to the suspect. Where he is now. He's at his house, Diaz offered from somewhere in the loose crowd of bikers, scared sober, probably for the first time in years. We didn't lay a hand on him beyond what it took to keep him from running. You want to go ask him yourself, be our guest. Harris hesitated, clearly weighing something internally, pride procedure, the particular discomfort of a man realizing that the people he'd spent his career viewing as the problem had just solved a problem he himself had abandoned without a second thought. I'm sorry, Harris said, finally turning back to Laura, and the words came out rougher than he intended, less polished than the apology he'd probably rehearsed somewhere on the drive over. I should have taken this more seriously. I should have done more. You should have, Laura agreed, no malice in her voice, just simple, exhausted truth. But it doesn't matter anymore. My son has his chair back. That's all I care about right now. Harris nodded slowly, looking once more at the scene in front of him, a scene that by every rule he'd ever been trained to follow should have looked like a threat, like exactly the kind of lawless chaos his badge existed to prevent, and instead looked like the only real justice this family had received since the moment that chain was cut. He didn't make an arrest that day. He didn't pursue the question of what exactly had happened to Vince Holloway beyond a vague, unofficial confirmation that the man was alive and apparently terrified into permanent silence. He simply got back into his car, sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, and watched through his windshield as Ethan Bennett wheeled himself in a slow, joyful circle on his own front porch, surrounded by a small army of men in leather vests who had done in 2 days what an entire police department had failed to even attempt. Mr. Man. The bikers didn't linger long after that. There was no celebration, no fanfare, nothing that resembled the kind of victory lap Laura might have expected after everything that had happened. One by one, the men climbed back onto their bikes' engines, firing up again in that same low rolling thunder, and Cole was the last to mount his, pausing for one final moment in front of Laura and Ethan. You did the right thing, Cole said to Laura, refusing to give up. A lot of people would have folded after a week of being told no by everybody who was supposed to help. You didn't. I didn't have a choice, Laura said quietly. He needed me to keep fighting. That's exactly what makes you the right kind of mother. Cole turned to Ethan, extending a hand which Ethan shook with a seriousness that suggested he understood on some level beyond his years exactly how significant this moment was. You take care of yourself, kid, and you take care of that chair. It's a part of you. I will, Ethan promised. I'll never let anybody take it again. That's right. Cole smiled, swung his leg over his bike, and looked back at Laura one final time. If anybody ever gives you trouble again, anybody, you call the number Marcus gave you. We don't forget the people we help. He pulled his sunglasses back down over his eyes, and within minutes the entire convoy was pulling away from the curb, taillights disappearing down the same cracked street, where 8 days earlier, Laura had walked for 6 straight hours papering telephone poles with a desperation that nobody seemed willing to answer. Laura stood on the porch long after the engines faded into silence, Ethan beside her in his chair. Both of them watching the empty street where 20 strangers had just rewritten everything Laura thought she understood about who actually shows up when the world falls apart. Detective Harris's car pulled away a few minutes later, too slow, almost reluctant, and Laura watched it go, with something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite resentment either. Just the quiet, complicated understanding that some debts get paid by the people who owe them, and some get paid by strangers who never owed anything at all. She looked down at Ethan, who was already rolling himself in slow, careful circles across the porch, testing the chair, reacquainting himself with a freedom he'd spent 8 long days afraid he might never get back. "You okay, Bug?" she asked. Ethan looked up at her, his face still glowing with a joy that hadn't faded one bit since the moment Cole carried that chair up the porch steps. "I'm more than okay," he said. "I feel like I can do anything again." Laura crouched down beside him, wrapping her arms around her son, right there in the chair that had cost so much, been stolen, broken, and brought back whole by people the world had taught her to fear. And for the first time in 8 unbearable days, she let herself simply feel grateful, without calculating what came next, without bracing for the next disaster. But somewhere across town, in a quiet house with an empty driveway where a truck used to sit, Vince Holloway was packing what little remained of his life into a single bag, finally understanding that the conversation in that abandoned bowling alley had changed something in him permanently, whether for better or worse, even he didn't know yet. 3 weeks passed, and in the city forgot, the way it always forgets. Fast, distracted, moving on to the next thing, demanding its attention. But on one cracked, struggling street in one small apartment, nothing about that morning would ever be forgotten. Laura sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd made 200 flyers by hand, the same table where she'd stared at unpaid bills until the numbers blurred together into meaningless static. Except now there was a different stack of paper in front of her, bills marked, paid, a small savings account statement she still couldn't quite believe was real. And beside it, a school enrollment form for an after-school robotics club Ethan had been begging to join for over a year. "Mom, can I bring my chair to show Marcus the new wheel guards?" Ethan called from his room, the particular casual confidence of a boy who had stopped somewhere in the last 3 weeks, flinching every time he talked about his chair, like it might disappear again. "Of course, baby. Show him whatever you want." She heard the soft hum of the motor, the familiar roll of wheels across the floor, sounds that had become so normal again so fast that it was almost strange to remember a time just 3 weeks ago when that sound had vanished entirely from her life and left behind nothing but silence and fear. Diaz had come by personally the week after everything happened unannounced, carrying a small toolkit just to check the chair's calibration one more time, make sure nothing had shifted loose during the reassembly. He'd refused to take a dime for it, refused to even a cup of coffee, just knelt on Laura's living room floor for 20 minutes, testing every joint and every wire before nodding once satisfied and leaving as quietly as he'd arrived. That was the thing nobody warned Laura about, that justice, real justice, the kind that actually fixed something instead of just filing it away, didn't come with closure ceremonies or thank you cards. It came and went, quiet and unglamorous, and then it simply continued existing in the background of an ordinary life that finally blessedly got to go back to being ordinary. Detective Frank Harris hadn't forgotten either, though what he carried away from that morning looked nothing like what Laura carried. He sat in his car outside the precinct most mornings now for a few extra minutes before going inside, something he'd never done before in 11 years on the force, just sitting thinking, turning over the particular discomfort of watching 20 men the law had taught him to view as criminals do, without hesitation, exactly what his own badge had failed to do. He'd pulled the file on Vince Holloway a few days after the incident, mostly out of professional curiosity, and found exactly what he expected. No formal complaint filed, no hospital report beyond a single ER visit for what the intake nurse had charted only as acute anxiety, possible substance withdrawal. Nothing that gave him grounds to open any kind of investigation, even if some part of him had wanted to. Vince had simply vanished from the neighborhood entirely within a week, gone without a forwarding address, gone the way certain men disappear, when they've finally understood in the deepest part of themselves that they've run out of room to make the same mistake twice. Harris never did file a follow-up report closing the wheelchair case. He found when it came down to it that he did not know how to write up what had actually happened in a way that fit any of the boxes on the standard form. Case resolved by unauthorized third-party intervention didn't quite capture the look on that boy's face when he rolled across his own porch for the first time in 8 days. Instead, Harris did something he'd never once done in his career. He drove past Laura Bennett's building on his own, time off the clock, just to see the porch, just to see if the chair was still there, chained up at night, the way it should be, ordinary and unremarkable, and exactly where it belonged. It was a new chain, heavier gauge, this time the kind Laura had bought with some of the money the club left behind. Harris sat in his car for a moment, looking at that chain, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel about a case he'd written off in under 10 minutes 3 weeks earlier. Shame. Quiet, private, and entirely deserved. He drove away without getting out of the car, without knocking on the door, without doing anything that might have turned a private reckoning into a public spectacle neither of them needed. But something in him had shifted permanently that morning on that porch, and it would follow him into every case that crossed his desk for the rest of his career. The quiet, nagging question of whether he was actually looking or just filling out a form and calling it done. Cole never spoke about that night again, not in any detail, not even within the walls of the clubhouse where stories like this usually got told and retold until they hardened into legend. He'd simply nod once if anyone brought it up and change the subject, the particular humility of a man who didn't need applause to know he'd done something right. But something had shifted within the chapter too. Something Cole noticed in the weeks that followed, a tightening of purpose, a renewed sense of exactly why men like them existed at all in a world that mostly just wanted to lock them away and forget about them. 2 more flyers showed up on the clubhouse bulletin board within the month, stuck there by members who'd started actively looking for exactly this kind of fight. An elderly widow whose late husband's life savings had been drained by a predatory contractor, a teenage girl being stalked by an ex-boyfriend the police had dismissed as just a custody dispute. Cole looked at both flyers, read every word, twice the same way he'd read Laura Bennett's flyer the night this whole thing started, and felt the particular grim satisfaction of a man watching his life's work finally point itself in a direction worth being proud of. "We taking these on?" Marcus asked, watching Cole's face as he set the second flyer down on the table. "We're taking these on," Cole confirmed. "Every single one we can find from here on out. If the system won't look, we look." It wasn't a new code exactly. It was the same code the chapter had always claimed to live by, the same unwritten rule about protecting the vulnerable that most clubs talked about more than they practiced. But Ethan Bennett's wheelchair had given that code teeth again, had reminded every man in that room exactly what it felt like to use their reputation, their resources, their willingness to do what badges and paperwork couldn't for something that actually mattered. On a Saturday afternoon, nearly a month after the chair came home, Laura stood at her kitchen window watching Ethan in the small fenced yard behind their building, racing his chair in slow, looping circles, while Marcus from next door, the real Marcus, the 8-year-old neighbor, not the biker, chased after him on foot, both boys laughing so hard the sound carried clear up through the open window. Her phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number. She answered, cautiously, old habits from those 8 desperate days still lingering somewhere beneath the surface of her newfound calm. "Hello, Ms. Bennett, it's Cole." Laura's whole chest warmed instantly at the sound of his voice. "Cole, hi. We're doing really well. Ethan's outside right now racing the neighbor kid in his chair." "Glad to hear it." A pause, the particular pause of a man working up to something. "Wanted to check in, see how things were settling, and I wanted to ask you something if you don't mind." "Anything." "There's a woman a few towns over. Similar situation, different details. Her husband's life savings got taken by somebody who should be in prison and isn't because the system moved too slow and the guy disappeared before charges ever stuck. She's struggling, same way you were struggling. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to her. Not about details, just about not giving up. About what it felt like when help finally came." Laura looked out the window at her son laughing free, rolling across the grass on wheels that worked exactly the way they were supposed to, and felt something settle into place inside her that hadn't been there before. Purpose, maybe, or the particular kind of healing that comes from turning your worst experience into somebody else's hope. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, of course. Give her my number." "Appreciate it." Another pause. "How's the chair holding up?" "Perfect," Laura said and meant it completely, like it never left. "Good." Cole's voice carried something warm now, something almost like pride. "So I should. That's exactly how it should be." They talked for a few more minutes, small things, ordinary things, the particular comfortable conversation of 2 people who'd been through something together that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. And then Cole said goodbye, and Laura set the phone down on the counter and walked outside to join her son in the yard. Ethan spotted her immediately, wheeling toward her at full speed, his face flushed and bright and completely beautifully ordinary. "Mom, did you see I beat Marcus 3 times in a row?" "I saw, baby, you're getting fast. The new wheel guards Diaz put on make me even faster. Watch this." He spun the chair in a tight, triumphant circle, throwing both hands up over his head, the exact same way he had in the photograph Laura had used on every single flyer she'd printed 3 weeks ago, except now that pose wasn't a memory of something lost. It was simply Tuesday afternoon. Simply ordinary. Simply a boy being a boy, free to move through his own life exactly the way he was supposed to. Laura crouched down and pulled her son into a hug right there in the grass, feeling the solid, steady hum of the chair's motor beneath her hands as Ethan wrapped his arms around her neck. "I love you," she whispered into his hair. "I love you too, Mom. Thanks for never giving up on finding it." "I never could have," Laura said quietly. "Not for you, never for you." She thought in that quiet moment about everything it had taken to get here. The cut chain, the indifferent detective, the 6 hours of walking with bleeding feet, the flyer that landed in the hands of a stranger on a leather vest outside a gas station 3 weeks ago. She thought about Cole's words on that very first night, the ones that had stuck with her every day since. Because somebody took something from a kid who already has it harder than most people will ever understand. And nobody who's supposed to help you bothered to. That doesn't sit right with me. It was a strange, complicated kind of justice. The kind that didn't come with handcuffs, or courtrooms, or any of the official machinery the world insisted was the only legitimate way to right a wrong. It came instead from men society had taught her to fear, who'd shown up at her door, not because the law required it, not because anyone was watching, but simply because a child's freedom mattered to them more than it had mattered to anyone wearing a badge. Laura did not know if she'd ever fully understand what that meant about justice, about the systems meant to protect people like her and Ethan, about who actually shows up when everything else fails. She didn't need to understand it completely. She only needed to know what she'd seen with her own eyes, that on the morning her son's whole world had been stolen out from under him, it wasn't paperwork that brought it back. It was 20 engines, one steady voice, and a code that refused to look away. And as Ethan rolled in another joyful circle across the grass laughing hall, free Laura understood with absolute certainty that some debts get repaid not by the people who owe them, but by strangers willing to stand in the gap when no one else will. And that real justice, the kind that actually heals something broken, doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears a leather vest, and it never asks for thanks.